Okay, awesome. So I guess I'll just get started. Hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Laura Corbin and I'm one of the presidents for the Student Safety Advocacy Society, which is a new uni club at UOW. I'm really excited because this will be our first event. So today we'll be having 7 panel members share their knowledge around the topic of sexual assault and sexual harassment, which will also be referred to as SASH. And members will be given time to address commonly asked questions and to provide any information on the topic that's relevant to their position. The panel will also be recorded and uploaded to our Facebook page for anyone who can't make it today or for anyone who needs to leave early. So before we get started, I'd just like to address a few disclaimers. So this will just be reiterating the information that was given to you all in the waiting room, but it's important to address again for anyone who may be viewing this after the event. So just to start off with some housekeeping, we ask that everyone keeps their mic and camera off for the duration of the panel. And just for precaution, if anyone does turn their camera on, then they will have to be removed from the event. If anyone would like to change their name on Zoom, then feel free to do so, although participant videos, names, and icons will not be visible on the recording of the event. So it's also important to recognise that the topic of sexual assault and sexual harassment can be quite confronting and emotionally triggering for some individuals. So if at any point you feel overwhelmed, then you're more than welcome to leave the Zoom. And we do encourage that you contact one of the support services on the document that's been posted in the chat that I'll do now and on the event page. So I've also just directly added to the chat some resources that are available for you to contact at any time of the day if you're feeling distressed about anything that's been brought up. So those resources include 1-800-RESPECT, the UOW Student Wellbeing and Support Line, and the New South Wales Rape Crisis Centre. So I'll also just now, for anyone who might be viewing this after the event, I'm just going to share my screen with a slide that just says those resources that I've just mentioned, just so that yeah, everyone has some instant access if they need any help and they know that these 3 lines are all 24/7. So if you guys, anyone watching would like to screenshot that, then feel free and I'll continue with the rest of the panel. Sorry, I just got to get all my Zoom things up and running. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm not the most technologically advanced person, so I might have a few blips here. Okay, cool. I'd also just like to note that the Student Safety Advocacy Society is not an official support network and that no one from our executive team has the appropriate training to respond to disclosures or to provide support as of yet. So please do utilise the support services and support networks on the document that will be provided shortly. Furthermore, any information that is provided to you today comes from the knowledge and perspective of the panel member and is in no way intended to be legal advice. So please do refer to a New South Wales government website for any information about a legal matter. I think I should also bring up that there was originally going to be a segment where viewers could ask panel members questions directly, but we recognise that given the sensitive nature of the topic, it's probably best that we gave you the chance to submit questions to us so that our executive team could filter through them and make sure that we don't get any inappropriate questions that might put anyone at risk of harm. So now that I've gone through the disclaimer, I'd just like to address the severity of the topic at hand. So I've just got a few statistics that I'll bring up. So almost 1 in 5 women and 1 in 20 men have experienced sexual violence, which includes sexual assault and/or threats since the age of 15. 1 in 2 transgender individuals are sexually abused or assaulted at some point in their lives. 1 in 4 women have experienced physical or sexual violence from a current or former partner. 71 perpetrators are men and the large majority of victims are women. And under 1 in 5 victims identify their perpetrator as a stranger. So I think in that it's obvious that a lot of perpetrators are known to the victim, which I think will be addressed later on in the panel as well. So now that we've gone through everything, I'll just remind everyone of what the club's all about. So the Student Safety Advocacy Society is a new uni club that aims to advocate for student safety through recognising the growing concerns surrounding sexual assault and sexual harassment. Our mission is to make students feel safer by acknowledging their experiences and working with the university to enhance the resources and support services available. So we aim to mediate between students and the university to give the student body a voice and to allow people to feel confident and comfortable on campus again. So some of our short-term goals include holding workshops and seminars to address concerns around sexual assault, sexual harassment and student wellbeing, such as the panel talk today. And providing events that create an environment where students can be social while feeling comfortable and safe, improving consent education and enhancing the resources for students in accommodation and on campus, and providing information about the existing resources that the university has to offer for students who have been put at risk of harm. So yeah, thankfully we are now officially affiliated with the university. So I'll post a link to the UOW Pulse page. That should already be in the chat, but I'll post it again later, where you can become a member of the Student Safety Advocacy Society. And if you haven't already, please give us a follow on our Facebook and Instagram, which will also be in the chat. I know Zoom's a bit weird, so yeah, people come on late, you might not have the information posted now, and you might not have any idea what I'm talking about, but I'll send everything through again towards the middle and the end of the panel, just to ensure that everyone has had the chance to see it. And I would also like to mention that I know it's been a long time in the making, but as I said, the club still has a fair bit to do before we can assist students ourselves. So I think this panel is a great opportunity for you guys to get more information while the club's just in the process of getting started up. So we'll now get started with the first segment of the panel. So basically, panel members will be given around 10 minutes to discuss any information about sexual assault and sexual harassment that is relevant to their position and to address any questions that are commonly asked to them. So we'll also have a section after everyone has spoken where we will address some of the questions that were sent through to us from the public forum as well. So yeah, I guess that's me done talking. So the first talker will be Dr. Joy Townsend, who is a sociologist and expert in young women's sexualities. Her work centres on the lived experiences of young Australian women. Joy works as an inclusion consultant, educator and writer, using her expertise to make the world a less violent place for women. She's one of Australia's leading consent researchers and educators, and the founder and CEO of sexual consent training organisation, Learning Consent. So yeah, Joy, if you wanted to say anything else for us.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and I just want to echo Laura's welcome to everyone. I actually completed my undergrad at UOW and my honours there, and so when I was connected with Laura and heard about the society, I was just so keen to yeah, to jump on board and be a part of what you guys are doing. It's so important. I remember I was at UOW 10 years ago now, and I remember not feeling safe at times on campus then, and my sense is that it hasn't improved. In fact, it's actually gotten worse, is what I'm hearing from students there. And so a society like this is so important. So yeah, just congrats to you all, to the executive team, for pulling it together, particularly at the moment when I know funding's really low or cut altogether, and you guys can't get together in person in Wollongong at the moment. So, you know, just yeah, hold strong and keep doing this amazing work, because it can really change students' entire lives and experience of studying at Wollongong University. 2 acknowledgements from me before I get started. I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians on whose unceded land that we're all meeting. I'm from the Yuin Nation, and yeah, just want to acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. And I also want to acknowledge the survivors in the room. I know statistically there will be a lot of survivors sharing this seminar today. I want to acknowledge the journey that you guys have been on to get to this point, and your bravery in being here and joining us for this event today. So a little bit about me and the work I do. I'm only going to speak for 5 minutes. So I did a PhD over 6 years at UNSW, looking at young Australian women's sense of self and identity to do with their sexuality. It's called sexual subjectivity, is the academic term, but essentially, you know, we talk about having a physical self, an emotional self, a spiritual self. We also have a sexual self. And my thesis was, what I was really curious about is, how do young women form a sexual self? How do they come to know themselves as a sexual being? And I made a point of ensuring that I interviewed a large amount of non-heteronormative young women, because overwhelmingly the research still in the space of gender and sexuality tends to prioritize a heterosexual sample. And so I interviewed a bunch of amazing young women, some in Wollongong, some in Sydney, some in Newcastle. I did 2 interviews with each woman, and they were just open, in-depth interviews. I asked them to tell me their life story with regards to their sexual selves. And the women ranged in ages from 18 to 33. And I went into that research process really curious. I fell into my own sample myself. I had a whole bunch of my own questions around my own journey coming to know my sexual self. And I was particularly careful to not ask the women about sexual violence or sexual assault, mainly for the reason that, like a lot of you in this room, that's a personal subject. Most of my closest friends are victims and survivors of sexual assault, and I didn't want to spend 6 years writing about that because I didn't think I would cope emotionally. However, time and time again in the interviews, the issue of non-consensual sex came up, specifically unwanted sex, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And so I ended up writing a chapter on unwanted sex. And it was probably my best chapter in the thesis overall. And that then turned into a training organisation, which is my own company now, called Learning Consent. And we do work in schools. We also work directly with young people and their parents, offering consent training. And really what we're all about at Learning Consent is opening up a safe space for conversations like these ones, where young people can bring their questions and explore the complexities of consent. So that's a big point of difference. You know, I'll be the first person to admit that sexual consent can be complicated. And I think that's why we're in the horrendous situation we're in today in Australia, as far as, you know, seeing an epidemic of sexual violence across our nation. And so that's what Learning Consent's all about. And I thought I'd just talk you through sort of the 4 common questions that I get from young people and from parents. So I'm just going to share my screen if I can. So can you all see that?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so the main question I often get, particularly from young women, but also from young men, is, was blah, blah, blah rape, or is that just normal? And I don't know if a lot of you remember, a couple of years ago, Aziz Ansari there was an article written about him on Babe about alleged sexual assault by a young woman, a young photographer who was going by the name Grace. And that was the huge thing around that story was, well, was that rape? Was that non-consent, or was that just bad sex? Traditionally in Western society, sexual experiences have been put into one of 2 categories: rape, which is the non-consensual category, and then normal sex. And I say that in, what do you call it? Those things, consensual sex. And similarly, unfortunately, consent is taught to be this really simple black and white thing as well, with the standard no means no, or if it's not yes, it's no approaches being the popular default positions taught in schools still. And this dichotomous approach hasn't served young people, because research, and certainly my own interviews with the young women that I did, demonstrated that so often our experiences of sex are far more complicated than this. The stories young women have shared with me suggest that this common yes or no understanding of consent just doesn't cut it. Often their stories don't include an obvious no, nor is there an explicit or an enthusiastic yes. Their stories, for the research I did, often traversed this space somewhere between rape and consensual sex. And it can be a really grey area. And just a trigger warning here, I'm going to share with you a quote from one of my participants retelling one of her experiences of this grey area of non-consensual sex. So Jane, she told me this story. She was in her mid-20s, and she said there was this awful time at Falls Festival where she had met a guy, and they got along really, really well. They were hanging out all day, and then that night they went back to his tent, and the whole way there she was saying to herself, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do this, but we've been hanging out all day and it's kind of like he's earned it. And I hear this from the young women that I interviewed over and over again. There's this unspoken rule, particularly in heterosexual dynamics, where if a woman hangs out with a man for an extended period of time, then she owes him sex. And Jane ended up going back to this guy's tent, and she said it was just a horrible, horrible experience. Pitch dark tent in the middle of the bush, so you couldn't see anything. And she said, thank God, because I was crying. I said, why don't I turn around, kind of thing, so he couldn't see my face. And then when it was over, I just left. Now, this story that Jane's told is a really common story of non-consensual sex, but what is and it's one of the case studies we actually use with our high school students in technical consent training, because there's neither a yes or a no in Jane's story. She wasn't forced in any way, and her sexual partner may not have been able to conceive of any apparent resistance. Yet Jane's understanding that her sexual partner had earned it places her in a position where she was not as free as she could have been to say no. Jane's story taps into a gendered unwritten rule regarding a female owing a male sexual activity as a kind of recompense for him having spent time with her, and it's a common misconception. And so another question that we get a lot of the time, I'm just going to try and move my slide if I can. Oh yeah, this is a wonderful quote that I'll share as well by Anna Creans. She said, a lot of us in our younger years are coerced to either define our experiences as one or the other, consent or rape, and not given the space or the tools to explore sexual encounters that are disturbing without deciding they are a victim or the other person is a perpetrator. This will feel really familiar if you're a young woman. And it's really damaging to individuals because we're constantly having to decide whether we were up for it, we brought it on ourselves, or we were attacked and we're a victim. There isn't room for a space where we can say, I don't know what happened here and I need to explore this, but I'm not quite ready to point the bone at anyone, be that myself or the other person. And so what I found really helpful is, and what we get asked a lot is, well, what is your definition of consent if it's not as simple as no means no? And we use this definition by Marie-Pierre Claret, which is consent means the choice to say yes to something. A meaningful yes requires the capacity to choose to say no and to have that no heard and respected at any point in time. And I think the key thing about Marie-Pierre's definition here is that it's not always an equal playing field when it comes to a person's capacity to say no, particularly for women. Our ability to say yes or no is complicated by numerous factors like gendered scripts and power dynamics, feeling ambivalent towards a sexual encounter, the impact of alcohol, drugs, and the management of complex pressures, whether it's social pressure or a relational pressure. And so the last slide I'll share with you, just conscious of the time, is this one here, which, oh, where is it? Here we go. I found this really helpful for talking and thinking through some of these grey areas of consent, of non-consensual sex. And so, you know, what's typically talked about is at this end of the continuum, which is rape or forced sex. And then at the other end is choice, where we have that capacity to say no or yes. But what I find a lot of young people and young women in particular struggle to put words to and to have the conversations about are those experiences of sex where they were coerced or felt pressured into it. And that's really where the grey area is. It's also the most common experiences of non-consensual sex statistically amongst young people. And a really useful way to open up conversations about this area of sexual violence is to talk about unwanted sex. We know from a national study that's run every 5 years in Australia that over 30% of high school students say that they've experienced unwanted sex. And that's, I would say, heavily underreported, that statistic. I'd say it's a lot more common than that. I don't know a single woman who hasn't had an experience of unwanted sex, even into, you know, a long-term partnership. And so, yeah, I just wanted to leave with that, that, you know, having these conversations around consent and sexual violence, a more productive way and a braver way to talk about this stuff is to be willing to discuss some of those grey areas and to find some language that we can put around those experiences where we're not yet ready to I guess, point the finger, but are oh so common and we know weren't a wanted experience. So I'll just stop sharing my screen there. And yeah, I might pass on to the next person, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of your insight about consent and the initiative that you've taken with learning consent as well. Another thing that I've kind of, I think it was Saxon Mullins, it was a quote from her where it said, if it's not an enthusiastic yes, then it's a no. And I think that's kind of one that stuck with me as well in terms of consent. And I know there's a lot of laws that are changing now around what is considered consensual and what isn't. And now I know perpetrators actually have to try to give some kind of evidence to say that they tried to get, that they asked for consent to begin with. Whereas before, I'm not exactly sure whether that was something that was deemed necessary. So I think, yeah, it's good to see that the laws are changing and that there are things coming into place, and that, you know, your company with learning consent is educating people on what consent really is. And for, you know, anyone who's viewing this panel, I'm going to link Joy's website. I think I might have already done that, but I'll link it again if you guys are interested in learning more about consent as well. So our next talker was going to be a social worker named Georgie. Unfortunately, she was unable to make it, although she's written up some useful information that her co-worker Sid will read out. So just as an intro, Georgie works at the Illawarra Women's Health Centre as a social worker and counsellor for a young person's program. She works closely with adolescents and focuses on intervention in consent education and opens safe spaces for conversation around self-care, sexual education, healthy relationships, and consent discussion. So Georgie is passionate about incorporating art therapy into her social work practice and is heavily focused on group work. So yeah, Sid, would you like to elaborate on what Georgie had to say?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna read off the speech that she wrote out for me, which was awesome. She's such a beautiful writer, so I hope I can elaborate it and speak the way I would know Georgie would speak, with a lot of passion. So she just mentioned that the reoccurrence of violence after the initial event often traverses down a multitude of terrains, whereby the experience of survivors is compounded by the burden of having to prove, justify, and continually tell the story of an event within the community to be witnessed and believed in the truth of what occurred. Additionally, when individuals who choose to use violence are not held accountable, when their actions are dismissed, or even recognized and celebrated, we are sending clear messages around what happens when survivors come forward with their painful experiences and whose story we value more in the community. Within the surge of the Me Too movement and the spotlighting of issues portraying the sexual violence within our society, we have seen a collective desire to prioritize consent education, an important step in understanding how education and learning is imperative in keeping communities safe and respectful. However, what is apparent within this is the ways in which people who have survived sexual violence feel that they have to carry this behavior change. Within the Young Women's Program in which Georgie runs, when sexual violence and sexual discrimination are unearthed in groups, the central therapeutic intervention is to maintain a space that young women can feel seen and believed in their experience, and that their opportunity to express and varying ranges of emotions in response, such as shame, sadness, anger, and confusion, to be seen in these emotions that can serve as a resource to connect with other emotions such as excitement, joy, and humor, and sometimes the drive to act, create change, or be in closer connection with themselves and or in their peers. The group process can act as a powerful reminder that we are not alone and an opportunity to open into trust and connection in safe ways. Creating containers where justice can be felt is crucial in a world that considerably lacks opportunities for justice for survivors of sexual violence. By supporting the experiences of belief, authentic expression about the event in a safe community of people can provide an antidote to the often isolating and re-traumatizing experiences of surviving sexual violence out in our community. What has been strongly echoed by young people I've worked with is these settings is a need and longing for an integrated and multifaceted framework that supports the survivors such as schools, in families, the media, and in government, so that the experience of violence can be held up and supported in a strong and connected way. There is a need to relinquish the onus of the survivor to carve their path in an admin smog, whilst having to hold many complex emotions at once, such as shame, guilt, fear, and sadness. Rather, what we can strive towards is to walk alongside survivors on the path that is clear, easy to navigate at a pace that feels safe and supportive for them. Young people I have worked alongside also vocalize how ineffective support for survivors and a lack of honest and effective consent education has more to do with the educator's inability to understand or connect to these dissonance to safe, positive, and healthy sexual experiences and how to support respectful relating. As a community, can we turn the lens inward and ask ourselves what our own relationship to sexual violence and respectful relating is? What have our own experiences been? What are the roots of our discomfort and perhaps our unwillingness to address these issues because we have been harmed or done harm? A commitment to fostering and investing in this establishment of more safe spaces for people to feel a sense of justice where they are believed and that they can show up in their complex array of emotions, just as they need to be safe and feel a sense of respect and support. As a community, this requires commitment, courage, and humility. Commitment to conversations and actions in the long term. Courage to ask ourselves painful questions about what we know and what we have experienced, and humility to know that we need to learn more. Centering survivors in a way that doesn't create more burden and experiences of violence, but rather a sense of freedom and empowerment to feel heard and believed. She's also put together a couple of reactions that we should be having if someone does come forward, and just like a little thing that we should be saying. So, I believe you, or it took a lot of courage to tell me about this. So it can be extremely difficult for survivors to come forward and share their stories, with the experiences of shame, blame, and concerns about being believed often arising. Avoid the question why and stand alongside. Remember that calmness is not a signpost that event did not occur. Everyone responds to violence very differently. Another one is, it's not your fault, or you didn't do anything to deserve this. Survivors may blame themselves, especially if they know the perpetrator personally. So remind the survivor, maybe even more than once, they are not to blame. You are not alone, or I care about you and here to listen or help in any way I can. So let the survivor know that you are there for them and willing to listen to their story if they are comfortable sharing it. Assess if there are people in their lives that they feel comfortable going to, and remind them that there are service providers who will be able to support them as they heal from this experience. Another one as well is, I'm sorry that this happened, or this shouldn't have happened to you. So acknowledging that the experience that has affected their life, phrases like, this must be really tough for you, and I'm so glad you're sharing this with me, helps communicate empathy so much. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much for that, Sid. Yeah, Georgie sounds like she's really passionate and everything that she's got to say about sexual assault and harassment, and I'm just really glad that you could step up and read that out for her. But yeah, hopefully maybe in events in the future, she might be able to come, which would be great. But yeah, so I think Georgie might have also mentioned to you that the Illawarra Women's Health Centre is just one of the many resources that's available specifically in the Wollongong area that people can go to for support. And I definitely think the idea of group sessions and things like that is definitely something that needs to be utilised more. So hopefully we'll see more resources and support like that in the future as well. All right, so our next speaker will be Stella. So Stella Topaz is a registered nurse who is also currently working at Illawarra Women's Health Centre. She has over 35 years of nursing experience across women's health, HIV and sexual health, youth housing, health policy and management, and working with LGBTIQA+ people and communities. Stella also works privately as a sexological body worker, which can be described as a sex ed and body ed for adults, using an embodied approach to consent, noticing, trusting and valuing what our bodies know about our desires and limits, and being able to communicate this to others. So yeah, Stella, if you'd like to introduce yourself and say a bit more.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm here in Port Kembla, which is Darawal land, and I've moved from Sydney a few months ago, so it's a wonderful way to meet some of the people in the community down here and to hear the activism that you're doing. I'm so pleased to be invited, thank you. I guess my way of coming to this topic is a little bit more about ways that we can start to understand and recover from transgressions of our consent, where our body has been violated, where we've had experiences of either not even being able to say no, or it doesn't matter if we say no. So that's the context that we're meeting in here today. And my work, I guess, as a sexological body worker is to work with people to connect with their bodies as a way of remaking the boundaries and knowing what you need for yourself and how to ask that. So in my work, I am normally seeing people who perhaps have had an experience of disconnecting from their bodies, or not being safe in their bodies, or having had an assault or harassment directed to them. It's not usually the reason that people come, though. People usually come along because they want something like, I want to feel more alive in myself, I want to have better relationships, I want to know how to ask for what I want, I want to speak up more, or they may come with things such as sex hurts me and I don't know why and I want to change that, or they may come with things like I feel like I can't communicate with my partner, my lover, or I'm not able to have the relationship that I want to have. Sometimes in doing some work around that, it's not uncommon, particularly for people who've been raised as girls and women, to have some kind of knowledge or history or experience of sexual assault, sexual abuse, or unwanted touch of some kind. So talking on a panel about consent, I've been thinking a lot about what the word in our current society sort of conjures up. So when people say consent, because of the climate that we've been in, particularly around the increase in talking about sexual assault in public ways, often consent is heard as a word that relates to when consent is broken. So we've almost associate consent with a threat or a fear. For many people, that can be associated with a threat or a fear of having your consent not respected or broken. And when you look at the dictionary definition of consent, it's kind of interesting to look back on the way the word came from English was to actually mean together feel. So con was together and sentai is to feel. So it used to be about what do we together feel? And what do I feel and what do I agree to with another person? And that's kind of the consent work that I do. So the consent work I'm doing is not so much about getting permission. We often think of consent about permission. So permission might be, consent is something that we give to someone or we get from someone. And we give or we get consent to transact something. So something like, I give my consent for you to give me an injection, or I get your consent so I can take a cutting from your succulent in your garden, or I give my consent for my friend to pick up my shopping from the supermarket under my name. So we think of it like a transaction. Working in a framework of body work or from the body is really moving towards the idea that consent is about an agreement that we come together to negotiate, and that both people have freedom in that and both people have choice in that. And Joy touched on that really beautifully in some of the quotes that you gave. I love those quotes that you gave, Joy, because it really talks about the intention around bringing us together bringing two people together or a group together to agree on something, and everybody has input to that. And that breaches of consent happen when someone steps out of agreement or refuses to participate in agreement. So the idea of working with consent in the framework that I'm working in is around helping people access pleasure in their bodies and access choice in how they want to communicate that pleasure with that desire or pleasure with somebody else. So I guess you can gather from that I'm not working with people at the time of crisis. I'm working with people who have who maybe are looking to shift the way they are able to participate after an assault, or after may even be a long ago assault or sexual abuse in childhood. But knowing that there's something in that I need to work on in my own body in order to be able to have relationships or work with the people I love. So the other thing I want to say is, so it's a lot about choice and learning choice. And what happens for so many of us is that we learn to go along with touch that we don't really want or like. So I'm not talking about when someone's forcing themselves and assaulting you, but I'm talking about situations where we learn, and particularly those of us socialised as girls and women, not only, but we're particularly taught around being girls and women to please other people, is that we learn to go along with touch that we don't particularly like. And so what we do is we feel it in the body. So someone comes up, someone you don't really know, or maybe even a work colleague, and you can see they're going to try and hug you. And I know my body starts going, oh, I don't want that touch. I don't want that touch. It's not a high risk situation, but it's unpleasant. So my body says that. I notice that, and then I go along with it for a whole lot of reasons. We all would know a lot of those reasons. We go along with it for social, to keep the peace, to not be a problem, to not, speak up. But what we learn over and over again is to keep pushing down those feelings. And then we can potentially kind of get disconnected from those feelings. So learning to not be able to take that step to speak up is no one's fault. It's really socialised. But then when you get in a relationship with someone, and maybe someone you want to have touch with or you want to have sex with, how do you learn to listen to your body around what you like, and how do you learn to ask for that? So some of the going along with dulls us from being able to identify what we actually do like, to notice that in our body. We're probably quicker to know what we don't like, but we still may not know what we do like. The other thing I guess I'm wanting to open up is the idea that touch and sex are not the same thing. And we often get taught that touch will lead to sex, or that touch and sex are the same thing. And some of the work in sexological body work as a practice is sort of pulling that apart and going, what touch feels pleasant or enjoyable on my skin that has no intention other than sensation, and noticing your sensation. Because if I can ask someone to touch my hand in the way that I like, it doesn't have to go anywhere else. It can just be to learn about touch and what I like. And then learning how to notice touch that you enjoy or like, and then being able to communicate that to another person, can become a foundation of remaking your ability to feel safer in your body. And if your body has felt unsafe, small, slow steps can help to re-establish that safety. So small steps around touch, curiosity, noticing, and paying attention to what you do and don't like, and having an agreement where at any time you can say pause or stop or keep going or no. So it's relearning all those components to reconnect with your own body around how you start to find your voice and find what gives you pleasure. So often people may come looking for help in those areas. And it could be anything from, I need to go and have a cervix screening test, used to be the pap smear. So people might show up for a cervix screening test or an STI test, and they can hardly give a history because they're so worried and fearful about the potential of an examination, if there's going to be an examination. And when you're in fear, your whole body is like, you can't really hear anything, and you're just working out how you're going to get through this moment. And the fear of touch or of an examination can then be as painful as the actual event itself. It can be more traumatic and difficult for people. So people might come with that, and the first kind of steps around that for me would be, nothing has to happen today that you don't want to happen. We can just talk, or we can work out a way around this, or we can find several different ways to approach this procedure. Like if someone does need to have a cervix screening test, it could be that you could take the speculum home and see if you can use that yourself, and then come back when you feel ready and see how we can do that. Or you could hold the speculum yourself, or we're going down the track now, hopefully, of having self-testing as well. So that will change a lot of these things. I guess what I'm getting at though is that working with people's bodies means respecting when their body's saying no. If someone's saying, no, just get it over with, I have to have the test, that's not something I want to proceed with. So I'll be like, how can we get to the place where you can actually consent to the test, not go along with it, not push down all your no and say yes when really it's a no. So those are parts of my sexual health work. I guess with sexological body work, it's then moving towards how do you find pleasure in your body. So pleasure could be described as being a feeling of pleasant sensations. So there's 3 components to pleasure that can sometimes be a way to look at this. So the component of the touch or the stimulation. So it might be a stroke of the hand. The sensation is a slow stroke. Then the other component can be the meaning or the context. So if it's my lover or someone a really darling friend, it might be if they're stroking my hand, the meaning of that is like, I really love that when you do that. That's so beautiful when you do that. I really enjoy that. And then the last component, that is me bringing my attention to that. So I bring my attention and I really notice that feels good on my fingers and my hand, that feels good. So it's the stimulation, it's the context, and then it's the meaning, the context and the meaning, and then it's my attention going there. Now, if a stranger walked into the room and did exactly the same touch, the same stimulus, and they stroked my hand, the meaning would be so different, because it's like, who are you? I did not invite that or want that. So the meaning changes and you can't have pleasure in that situation. So for pleasure to be present, there needs to be those 3 components: the meaning, the context, the sensation, and the sensation and your attention that you bring to that. So working with body work to reconnect with how you have pleasure is really starting to introduce those components so that you always have control of those three areas. And then you learn to take that into your relationships with other people. I'm doing a time check. I'm probably at time, am I?
Yeah, but thank you so much for everything that you've just brought up as well. I think having some insight on self-love, and as well as just, doing small steps to really start to get in touch with your body again and feel like you have control is just so important, especially for victims who might feel like they've lost that control as well. So I think what you're doing is really amazing, and I'm hoping to hear a lot more about it in the questions, because I think there might be a lot that would be addressed towards you as well. So all right, we'll go on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Gemma. She is a PhD student studying breast cancer at the University of Sydney. She's a sexual assault survivor and advocate. She advocates for better consent education by assisting Chanel Contos at Teach Us Consent, and advocates for improved victim services with her soon-to-launch organisation With You We Can. So this is an experience-informed hub of resources, support and answers that will ultimately encourage more victims to share their story and normalise formal reporting. With You We Can, once reporting and the process that follows to feel empowering, for victims to know that standing up for themselves means standing up for all victims, and for them to never feel alone when they do it. So yeah, Gemma, please feel free to talk more about this.
Thank you for the warm introduction. Hi everyone, I'm really happy to be here. I'm really impressed with this society and the initiative because it's really, really needed. Obviously, we're in a time where rape culture is so endemic in society, so this is just so great. And it really aligns with the organisation that I'm about to launch, which you just introduced. But I'll get to that. So today I'm just going to speak really briefly about my experience of sexual assault and how it's led me into the advocacy space and what I'm doing in that space. I've been working a bit with Joy behind the scenes at Teachers Consent with Chanel to improve consent education in Australia, which is obviously really in need of improvement. So we've been doing a lot of research in the background of what the current curriculum looks like and also what needs to be sort of updated or changed in order to ensure that the generations that come are not going to have the same problems that we have obviously had. So similar to that, I've been working on this survey with the sociologist from Sydney Uni, which is going to investigate young people in New South Wales' experiences of consent and sexual assault, and ask them to reflect on their perceived learning of these concepts in school sexuality education and also from other sources. This was really inspired by Chanel Contos's Instagram poll, which he launched back in February, which had over 6,000 testimonies of sexual assault, which was horrifying but also unsurprising. But what I found really remarkable about this was that so many victims were willing to tell their story. And what was kind of annoying about it from like a data perspective, because I'm a PhD student and I work with numbers, was that we couldn't extrapolate a lot of statistics from that because there wasn't any closed-ended questions involved in the testimonies. They were just open-ended where people told their stories. So I thought it would be really important to put together a survey that asks some of those questions and addresses some of the things that we really need to get some good facts for. A lot of it is sort of consistent with what Joy was saying about unwanted sex. I think a lot of young people in Australia have unwanted sex, and which is for a lot of people really traumatizing experiences, which it isn't until much later on that they reflect and realize that it was actually sexual assault. And I think education comes into this. So hopefully we can get some good statistics on how many of these experiences are sexual coercion, where people are consenting, just not voluntarily. So as Laura mentioned, I'm about to launch a victim support network with a friend and fellow victim. It's called With You We Can, and it's basically a support network which aims to empower victims to tell their story and report their perpetrator. We think one of the most effective ways to end this rape culture is to empower victims to hold their perpetrator accountable, because these offenders thrive in this culture because they know they're going to get away with it. You know, victims are too scared to talk, and it's really, really sad. It saddens me because I was part of the 10% who did report. So 5 years ago, I was assaulted by a friend, like most victims, and so like the stat that Laura said at the beginning, it's less than 1 in 5 victims identify their perpetrator as a stranger. I think this contributes to the fact that I think it's over 90% of victims don't report their sexual assault, because it's this weird situation where either you don't really see it as sexual assault or you feel guilty reporting them because you're like, oh, they're a friend or they're someone I know, they're a partner. So it was really difficult for me. I didn't actually really recognize my experience of sexual assault until a friend who was there asked me, are you going to go to the police? And that was like a real triggering moment, because I was like, why would I go to the police? And I really had to put it together that I'd just been sexually assaulted. And then it wasn't until another friend who wasn't there and who was quite separate from the group and had no connection to the person who assaulted me asked me, if I was going to the police. And again, I said, I don't think so. She said, well, what would you do if this was a stranger? If a stranger did that to you? And that really hit me. And I knew I'd be at the police if it was a stranger. Like I knew in my bones, like that's how I would have responded. So a couple of days later, I reported him, which was difficult and like really lonely, the whole experience, but I never regretted it for a minute. The whole process gave me this amazing sense of pride and achievement, knowing that I had made him sit there and listen to what he's put me through, and knowing that I stopped him, or hopefully stopped him from doing it to anyone else. So yeah, it was like a 3-year period of investigation and waiting for court dates, and we finally got to court and he was convicted, which was really amazing and unexpected. I feel like all we hear about the justice system is horror stories, and we don't hear enough good stories. And I think if you speak to enough victims who have been through it, you'll actually come to find that it's more good stories than bad stories, even despite the lack of justice in the end. So I think it's silly how we call it a justice system, because for a lot of victims, they never feel that justice. But I guess if we talk about it as a process, victims do find a really strong sense of, I guess, pride and invincibility after going through that process, even if they don't get a conviction. So with You We Can is an organisation that my friend and I are starting so that we can basically form a big group of victims to mentor each other. It's like a support network where they can come together and ask each other questions, look for guidance, ask for answers that they don't want to ask the detectives or the DPP, the scary authorities that they're too scared to approach on their own. They can come to a victim who's been through it and has had similar experiences. So that's what we're doing at the moment. We're just in the stage of waiting to be registered as a charity, and our website is almost up and running. So when we launch, it's going to be really great to collaborate with this society, because I would love to be a resource that Laura can pass on to people. You know, if the victim comes forward and doesn't really know what to do, they're contemplating reporting, but they don't know what that would involve. They're scared of the stigma, they're scared of being alone. They can talk to someone who's been through it and get really honest answers, which I think is really important. I never had that experience, and I really just want to make other victims feel comfortable doing what I did. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming forward, especially with your story and having the courage to share that as well. I know, you know, given the statistic that I said at the start, I think a lot of the things that you've said might have resonated with a lot of people that could even be viewing this right now. So yeah, it's obviously a great initiative that you've taken as well with You We Can. I think it could really make a difference in the lives of survivors, because just having that resource can be so comforting for people, and just feeling like they're not going through the experience alone, and encouraging people to find empowerment in speaking out and reporting their experiences. It's just like such a truly big step. And yeah, I know the website is currently in the draft stage, but I'll definitely upload the finalized link to all of our social medias once it's up and running, because I think that'd be amazing for everyone to have and to be knowledgeable about. So yeah, thanks again, Gemma. All right, so next up we have Sophie and Ash, and they are administrators within the New South Wales Police Child Abuse and Sex Crime Squad. So the Child Abuse and Sex Crime Squad coordinates the New South Wales Police Force response to child sexual abuse and serious physical abuse or extreme neglect, as well as adult sexual offences that are complex and require a high-level specialist response. Sophie is finishing up a Bachelor of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and Ash has just completed her Bachelor of Psychology and just commenced her Masters of Intelligence and Criminology. Part of their role within the squad is to record sexual assault reporting options, so the SARO reporting option, which is an alternate reporting option for those who do not wish to make a formal statement. Through processing these reports and through their exposure to the inner workings of the squad, they have developed a strong understanding and passion for the need to improve education around sexual violence and consent. Sophie and Ash here today to break down what they have learnt about the prevalence of and lack of understanding of what sexual assault actually is, as well as discussing what they think needs to change in order for us to create a safer space for young women through consent education. And I'll just extend to that young people in general and anyone in general who may have had an adverse experience, has experienced sexual assault and sexual harassment. So yeah, if you guys wanted to continue on that, that'd be amazing.
No worries, thank you. So basically working in a child abuse and sex crime squad has definitely exposed us to an array of issues that we weren't privy to before, which we feel like they're really important for young people or just people in general to know about. So we spent a lot of time reflecting back on our time at school. And I think we both feel like we were very naive and very unsure about consent, about how to say no, and especially how to identify coercive behaviours. There were so many grey areas for us that Joy sort of touched on a little bit before, and I think we really just need to clear up these grey areas by really empowering people with the knowledge and ability to say no, and to sort of learn how to keep themselves safe. So as mentioned, part of our role is to record all SAROs or sexual assault reporting options that come into the office. So Ash will touch on those in a little bit. But one big takeaway from those, or that we've sort of learned through recording those, has been reading the stories of so many people, young people and young women in particular, who just weren't taught about consent and who don't sort of fully grasp what sexual assault often looks like. So I think certainly for me as a young person going through school, sexual assault is often sort of identified as the girl who drank too much at the party. And I think a lot of what we don't talk about are those who are in relationships or who are dating or who maybe at one time did consent to a sexual relationship. However, they do change their mind, which obviously they're in their rights to do. And so I guess a big thing for us is that consent is fluid. It is ever changing. And I think a lot of what we see is that survivors who say they didn't identify what happened to them as sexual assault at the time because they didn't understand that what happened to them was sexual assault, and they didn't know how to sort of say no or what consent actually means, and that it can change at any moment. So just because they may have said yes at the beginning of the night, obviously doesn't mean they can't say no at any time after that. So one sort of theme with a lot of the SAROs is that a lot of the girls note that it wasn't sort of until they actually spoke to a friend or a counsellor, for example, that they did actually say to them, well, hang on, that is actually sexual assault. And again, as Gemma touched on, are you going to report that? That sort of does trigger a lot of them to come forward. And so I just sort of want to touch on just a quick definition of sexual assault from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. So sexual assault is a type of sexual violence that involves any physical contact or intent of contact of a sexual nature against a person's will, using physical force, intimidation or coercion. And one thing that sort of stood out to me was that half of women did not seek advice or support after their most recent incident of sexual assault perpetrated by a male. So I guess the fact that half of us don't seek advice or support after being victimised, in my opinion, suggests that a lot of survivors don't seek support because they haven't been able to identify what has happened to them is actually classed as sexual assault. Or perhaps they don't feel comfortable or knowledgeable enough about what resources are actually available to them. So on that, I'll just pass over to Ash just to sort of touch on SAROs, just to kind of give you an idea about that as an alternate reporting option.
Yeah, so essentially the SARO is a sexual assault reporting option. It allows victims of sexual assault to give police information about the sexual assault. You can give as much or as little information as you like. A lot of people do submit them anonymously, or you do have the option to give your name and your contact details, and you can it can be used as the beginning of an investigation. So the SARO runs through a series of questions that asks you from an investigation point of view. So there are questions about the perpetrator, what happened, the setting, and there's also questions about yourself. But as I said before, you can give as much or as little information as you like. Obviously, if you're looking to get the incident investigated, they obviously want as much information as you can provide, or as you're willing to provide, that is a really difficult thing for a lot of survivors. So the police are very, very understanding that you may not want to do that, or you may not be ready to do that, but at a later stage you may want to. So it's essentially up to you how much information you want to provide. What happens is it goes on record, so we process them. So that's what part of our job in the sex crime squad. So we process them. You will be given a reference number, and then that'll be as much contact as you'll get if you've said that you don't want to be contacted by police. That way, at a later stage, if you say, or if you change your mind, I want to have this investigated, or whatever your change of heart may be, you can go to your local police station and say, I have this event number, this happened to me, I'd like to follow up on it. Another really good part of the SARS is the intelligence that the police can use it for. So if your perpetrator is perhaps offending against other people as well, that's really useful information for the police, because from an investigation point of view, obviously, as you can imagine, as much evidence as possible is optimal. So that's essentially what the SARO is most effective for. Another big part of it is it can be really, really useful just to get it off your chest and have it reported to police. We have a lot of people writing in saying, I don't want this investigated, but it's really important for me to, say that this happened. I want the police to know about it. I don't want any action taken, because that is, another bridge to cross that a lot of victims don't want to get to, but it can be a really therapeutic thing to report it and say, this happened to me. I survived this. I don't want to follow up on it, but I may want to in the future. If you do want to follow up with it, obviously you nominate that on the form, and the police will get in contact with you. If you have been sexually assaulted and it's not a historical incident, you do need to go to your local police station. If it's within 72 hours, they can do a SASH, which is essentially a medical examination. So if you've got any clothes or anything, I can't speak to the legalities of that because I'm not a police officer, but the information is all on the police website. To find the SARO is also on the police website. So if you just Google sexual assault reporting option, it will be the first link, I believe. Is that right, Soph?
Yeah, on the police public website.
Yeah, so that'll have the SARO as well as other support services that you can access. I know that some other services have been touched on during this presentation as well, which are really good. So there are plenty of things that you can do after an experience of sexual assault, which we're working on making those resources more available. We are working on making the SARO more accessible, a bit easier to use. So Queensland have a really good SARO, their version of a SARO that they use that is really, really accessible. But mostly we are working on just making it well known to the community, especially to young women, because a lot of people don't know about it until they've sought help, and like a psychologist or whoever it may be has said, you can submit a SARO, this may help you. But yeah, essentially, as I said before, you can fill in as much or as little information as you like, but it's a really good resource for both yourself as a victim and the police for an investigation, or even as an intelligence piece. So they are really, really helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah, I think,
sorry.
I'll wrap it up, one sec. So I guess just in terms of where to from here, I also just sort of wanted to echo the work that Joy and Gemma are doing on their Teach Us Consent page. We have liaised with Joy previously when we did want to make contact with our high school, with the headmaster, in terms of actually trying to implement some consent education there. And I think that really is the crux of what needs to happen moving forward. It's education, without knowledge, without understanding of what sexual assault and consent actually is, then this culture is just going to continue. And so I think it really just starts in the schools, it starts with us, and it's really important to have these conversations with your friends, your family, colleagues, anyone that will listen, even though it's obviously a bit uncomfortable. It's just so critical that we talk about it, and give ourselves and our friends the opportunity to talk about their experiences if they choose to do so. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Yeah, I definitely agree. It's really important that people are aware of the SARO reporting option, just because it gives victims so much more control over the situation. And I think obviously it'd be so beneficial if they ever decide to pursue a case with that as well, just having all the information already there. So I'm just being a bit wary of time, so I'm sorry, Grant, to cut you a bit short of time. But yeah, so next up we have Grant Jacobs. So he's the Associate Director for the student residents at UOW's Belangale, Graduate House and Market View student residencies. In the lead up to the National Student Safety Survey in September, he has joined UOW's Safe and Respectful Communities team, so the SARC team, to provide staff leadership and to assist UOW with their participation in the survey. So the Safe and Respectful Communities team is responsible for leading the university's work to prevent sexual assault and harassment from occurring on our campus, and for providing a supportive first response in the event of a disclosure. The SARC team can help students access counselling, academic support, and can assist them with reporting incidents to the police. They encourage all members of the community to speak out and report behaviour that is threatening, offensive, or harassing in any way. So yeah, Grant, please tell us more about your role within SARC.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Laura. And thanks also to the speakers who went before me. Sorry, I didn't turn my camera on. I joined a little bit late, so I joined when Gemma was speaking, and I'd like to reiterate Jenna's sentiments and to say thank you to you, Laura, and your team for putting this event on and for inviting me to present today. And thanks also to the club, because we have been working with the club, and I think it's been a really collaborative partnership and really rewarding for me so far. So thank you to you and everybody in the club. You mentioned you've given a brief introduction there of what the Safe and Respectful Communities team does. Here at UOW, or most universities, we often use lots of acronyms. So the acronym that we use here for our team is SARC. You mentioned the National Student Safety Survey, and I might just start there just to let people know what's happening in the higher education sector. In September this year, Universities Australia has commissioned the Social Research Centre to undertake a follow-up survey into the prevalence of sexual assault and sexual harassment on university campuses. I say a follow-up survey because the initial survey was done in 2016, and it was done, again, commissioned by Universities Australia, but it was administered by the Australian Human Rights Commission in 2016, and I think the final report for every university was released to universities around 2017. That was around the time when the SARC portfolio and the SARC team here at UOW was established. The survey on this occasion, the survey will run from the 6th of September to the 3rd of October, so it's approximately 4 weeks. As I said, it'll be conducted by the Social Research Centre. 10,000 students from every university in Australia will be invited to participate in the survey. And the survey itself, whilst dealing with a very difficult matter, will only take 10 to 12 minutes to complete, is the advice that they've given us. So I just wanted to encourage everybody who was on this call who may be a student to promote that survey. So from next week, you'll start to receive some student communication around the survey, and we'll ramp that up in the lead up to the survey. But if you could amplify that for us, that'd be brilliant. We'd really love to have as many of our students reporting on this matter as possible. On this occasion, they'll take some time to produce the final report, and we expect the final report to come in towards the end of February 2022. And that's really critical for us and for every other university, because the final report will inform our next action plan around how we work to prevent, but also to manage instances of sexual assault and sexual harassment on campuses. The other thing that I think Ashley potentially mentioned this earlier in her talk was she touched on consent training, and I just wanted to very quickly mention that one of the strong bits of feedback that we've had through our student advisory council here on campus and through other student groups is that those groups would like to see consent training mandated. So we're working towards that here at UOW. We're currently in discussion with an organisation called Our Watch. They partner with Universities Australia, and they essentially they produce and help with a lot of gender-based violence programs. So at the current time, we're just chatting with Our Watch to get some reporting on the various consent modules that exist out there, so that we can evaluate what's best for UOW and follow through on that action to make consent training mandatory. I did want to jump in because Laura did ask me to talk a little bit about what SARC does, and you touched on those points in the introduction there. I'll just go over them again. So the two key things why SARC exists: one is to prevent sexual assault and harassment from occurring on campuses, and that's through education programs, awareness programs. And the other thing is to provide a supportive first response in the event that a student or somebody else on campus needs to make a disclosure. We know that a student disclosing an incident of sexual assault or sexual harassment can be very challenging to navigate. And so our approach here is very much a support-first approach. That means that our highest priority is making sure that the person making the disclosure feels safe. And we consider all aspects of safety, so physical, emotional, and psychological. So what are some of the things that we can do? As you said earlier, Laura, we help students to access counselling. That counselling can be university-based. So the university has a counselling service, or I think it's recently been renamed to a Student Mental Health and Wellbeing Service. But there are experts within that service who can deal with matters of sexual assault, sexual harassment. But we can also refer through that service. We can also refer to expert community-based services. And I'm sure you've heard about some of them earlier in some of the presentations today. We appreciate that every situation is different. Everyone will have a different circumstance and different needs. So we're aware that we need to be broad in our thinking and flexible in terms of how we provide that service. As an example, people often think that we exist only to provide services to students who may live in accommodation, and that's not the case. Or it might be sort of from a Wollongong-centric perspective, and they think that we only provide support to students who live within the Wollongong region, and again, that's not the case. As you may know, the university's got 4 campuses on the south coast, and we have 3 campuses in metropolitan Sydney, so we support those students as well. And you may not know that we also support students who are offshore. So at the moment, we have some students who are stuck offshore who may have returned home because of COVID and can't come back. We support students, not just with sexual assaults and harassment matters, but other safety matters as well. And pre-COVID, we also supported students who may have done a study abroad at an institution overseas. And equally here in Australia, we also support students who have to go on practical or clinical placements. And unfortunately, sometimes when they're doing those sorts of placements, sometimes these incidents do occur. So we work with those workplaces, we work with the police, and we support the student through that event. So I guess the point I'm making there is that our service is quite broad, and it's not just restricted to immediately here on campus. We appreciate...
I was just going to say, I'm so sorry. I do have to be really wary of the time because we do have a
lot okay.
as well. But I will just note as well that I have, I've got the link to the SARC website as well. So if you guys do want any more information there, then feel free to send that, to check that website out as well. But yeah, as I was going to say, thank you so much for informing us about the services that are here for students at UOW. I think there might be a few people participating that are just part of the general public as well, or from other universities. So I do encourage that you guys also reach out to your own services at different universities, and also any support services that may be in your local area that could support not only you, but other people that you know that might benefit from that support as well. So I guess that wraps up the first segment of the panel. Thank you all so much for contributing your knowledge in the area of SASH so far. But now we'll be moving on to our next segment of the panel, where I will address some questions that have been brought up to us either for the panel as a whole or for someone in the panel specifically. And we do have a lot of great questions, which is why I just, sorry, I'm so sorry for cutting you off. But yeah, sorry, I just, we'll bring some of them up now. So the first question that I will address is, how do I tell a partner that I have been sexually assaulted, and how can they be considerate about my experiences when we are intimate? And so this is just under the category of partners and relationships that I'll be speaking about. So if anyone would like to turn your mic off if you think that you have some contribution towards that, I'll give about a minute for each question or less.
I'll just say, because I went through this experience and I felt a lot of guilt for a long time about not having told my partner. And I just want to say, like, don't ever feel like you have to tell your partner. If you're not ready to talk about it, like, it's not something you have to disclose to them. If you think you're ready, then I guess it will be a difficult conversation. But if you don't know how to have that conversation, or you're finding it difficult even comprehending it, then don't feel like you have to. You don't owe it to anyone to disclose that information. But I guess if it is impacting your intimacy in other ways, then I guess, yeah, it's something worth considering. But it might just be another path, like just talking about, without explicitly talking about your experience of sexual assault, I guess just talking about what you are comfortable with and what you aren't comfortable with intimacy-wise is all I'd say.
Yeah, I think that kind of leads on to another question that I was going to ask as well, that's been brought up a few times in the response form. So how can you establish boundaries in your relationship if your partner is more sexually adventurous than you? And how can I tell my sexual partner that I don't want to explore things like BDSM or kinks without a fear of ruining the relationship? So I'm just wondering if anyone might have a bit more information on that.
I'm going to speak a little bit. Can I speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a massively huge question, and I think it's going to be really hard to try and do any justice in a really short space of time. But I guess the part of the question there is, how do I even talk to my partner about this, or this? Like that question relates to what is the way that you and your partner can communicate around things that are really dear to you or that are scary for you. So I know the topic is really important about sexual adventure or other sexual activities that someone wants and someone doesn't. But underpinning that is, how do I have a relationship with my partner where we can talk and listen to each other in a way that's productive and supportive of each other? So to me, that's a bigger question around building communication, learning how to process difficult issues, maybe needing help with that. It can be useful to get help. It can be useful for one person to have a way to do some of that work on their own, or it can be useful for both people to go and have some help together. Or it can be about stepping back to starting to look at what is important within our relationship and how do we nurture that, and how do we value each other's desires and wants, even if we cannot meet them or don't wish to.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that as well, I guess, kind of leads on to another question that was here, was how do you recognize or address that your partner is pushing boundaries in terms of consent, especially if you're in a relationship that might be abusive, manipulative, or have a trauma bonding type style. So I guess also a big part of that would be people recognizing whether if, they really do feel respected by their partner, if they feel like their partner is, withholding the boundaries that they've put in place, or maybe even people who might not feel comfortable to put those boundaries in place. I think that kind of says as well, it's still a situation in which there's not consent there. And I think it's something that really needs to be discussed a lot between partners, and there does need to be that respect there. So I guess another question that I'll just quickly ask is, just like, because I thought it was really important to address this, just because I know that the issue is predominantly seen within women, but I think it's important to address males who might have had an adverse experience as well. So here's a question. What are some individual level steps to rewrite the myth that sexual assault is a female only problem? And then how can we encourage males to feel comfortable in saying no? And how can we help them not feel like their experiences have impacted their identity as a man? I know this might be hard coming from an all-female panel. Maybe Grant has anything to add on that.
I don't really have any lived experience, Laura, so difficult for me to comment directly. In terms of helping males to say no, was that one of the other questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think bystander intervention training is a really strong component, and I think males calling each other out is a really important tactic and tool. I think that's one of the types of trainings that we're considering developing and running here at UOW. So, firstly, just getting males to openly talk about what's considered respectful behaviour and what's not, and then encouraging them to have the confidence to call out these issues when they see them occurring.
Yeah, because I guess. Oh, sorry. Yeah, if you wanted to add something, Stella.
Just add that I think it's really difficult for anyone to speak out about sexual assault, and then there's layers to that, as we're hearing. There's layers about gender, there's layers about sexuality. There's a lot of myths that men can't be sexually assaulted, or that people in the queer community would never sexually assault someone. They're all myths. They're not true. And so part of what helps in this is people speaking out and being believed, and also understanding that everybody faces some shame or guilt, or potentially, and gender is part of that. It's not worse for men than it is for women. It's not worse for transgender people than it is for lesbians. But sometimes the incidents and the circumstances are worse. Sometimes the social environment can add to the situation that is happening. So it's trying to understand that it's hard for everybody, but you need to find the avenues where you're most likely to get your support and be believed. And I think every time people speak out, when men speak out, when lesbians, when transgender people, when bisexual people speak out, they're actually naming that this happens across all classes, at all ages, all cultures, all sexualities, all genders. But it sometimes is located much more in some of those sub-communities and subgroups, and certainly is more prevalent for women. But I think we do have to recognise that the barriers that men are speaking of are not always as different as they may appear. It may be that it's newer or earlier for groups of men to speak up.
Yeah, I think as well, just leading on to that, with general societal views around sexual assault and sexual harassment, there is a question here. To help decrease the stigma associated with SASH, what can I do as a general member of the community to promote open conversation? And how can I discuss SASH in a way that is lighthearted and not too heavy or traumatic? I think if anyone wanted to give it a crack.
Well, I would just say, I think that really depends on who you're associating with and what your kind of target audience is for having those conversations. I mean, I know personally when I went through my experience, it was really difficult with a lot of my male friends who were friends with the person who assaulted me to adjust. And it was really, really difficult. And it made them feel really uncomfortable when I'd bring up my experiences, but I would do it anyway, despite the uncomfortableness of it all, because I knew it was really important for them to understand it. I think if it's a conversation about bringing up awareness and getting maybe specifically boys to understand, I feel like sometimes it's a difficult thing. Males don't quite get the fear that women live with constantly, of fear of sexual assault. And so sometimes it's good to ask them to reflect. It's crazy that we have to do this, but sometimes it's good to ask them to reflect on their experiences of consent and sexual encounters, and whether they may have had any experiences with someone where they may not have been consenting, and then to think about ask them to think about those experiences, and put one of their female relatives or close friends in that situation. I think that's a really effective way of having those conversations, which are quite uncomfortable, but they've got to be had.
Yeah, and I think that kind of just reminded me about a whole bunch of statistics that I kind of got from the first responders course, that kind of showed some good examples of just different things that we can change in society to really change people's perspectives around sexual assault. So I'm just going to read a few of them out, actually. So 1 in 7 people believe that women are partially responsible for being sexually assaulted if they are affected by drugs or alcohol. 1 in 6 Australians think that men should take control in relationships and be head of the household. And another thing kind of attached to the statistic is that violence is more common in families and relationships in which men control decision making. And then another statistic is 1 in 3 Australians think it's natural for a man to want to appear in control of his partner in front of his male friends, which I think is just another thing that kind of comes along with sometimes the whole boy mentality. And I think, yeah, it's definitely something that people should be addressing, especially because, you know, another thing here is so it's just like 1 in 4 Australians see no harm in telling sexist jokes, which I think, you know, can kind of be encouraged in that mentality as well. And I think it's something that we all kind of need to take a step back from and say, what is this really doing for victims, and what is this really doing to the women that are hearing all of this? And I just think, you know, I think something eventually needs to happen where people feel comfortable in speaking up about these things, because as you said, Gemma, it can be an uncomfortable topic, but I think having someone feel uncomfortable about a topic that's affecting so many people, you know, I think it's something that just needs to happen. It's a discussion that needs to be brought up, and it's something that needs to be paid a lot more attention to. So I am just taking note of the time. I think I might just address one more question as well that was more specified towards one group. So in your individual areas from personal experiences, have you found that the LGBTQ plus community experience sexual assault and sexual harassment differently, or have specific issues in comparison to their non-LGBTQ plus counterparts? Because I think
I'll answer that really briefly, and it speaks to the question from the male participant as well. My studies revealed that sexual assault definitely presents differently in the LGBTIQ community. I mean, there's still the underlying issues of power dynamics and inequality, regardless of the genders involved in a relationship. But certainly for young homosexual men, there's a really high prevalence of sexual assault from older homosexual men, particularly in formative sexual encounters, and particularly with strangers. So where those sexual encounters are arranged using a dating app, usually in a public place, there's a high prevalence of young men being sexually assaulted in that situation. And so much higher than in heterosexual dynamics. And so, yeah, to answer, the short answer would be yes, they do present differently, and that's an example of how they present differently and where the risk is particularly high for young men. Yeah, and when I say young men, I'm actually talking about minors as well there. And so, what would be classed technically as pedophilia?
Yeah, I think it's just, I think every group of people have their own experiences as well with that, and I think there's a lot of differences, but whether it's between men, women, Indigenous communities, people with disabilities, and you know, I think there's so much more to it, which is obviously why as well with the club we've got different diversity officers that might have more knowledge within those specific groups and how to manage issues around that. So, all right, I'll say that was our last question for the panel today. On behalf of everyone from the Student Safety Advocacy Society executive team, I'd like to give you all a massive thanks for generously volunteering your time to talk today about such an important cause. You've all taken the initiative to make a change in sexual assault and sexual harassment related issues in some way, which makes the work that all of you do so amazing. And I really hope that together we can all make a change by drawing awareness to the significant issue of SASH. And I'm just really excited to see what else our club can achieve. And for anyone who's watching, please keep your eyes peeled on any social medias that we have, just for any future events, if you found this one interesting or felt like you got some use out of it. And just as a final note, please do seek out support if you are feeling distressed from anything that's been brought up today. I'm going to send through the support services document in the Zoom chat again, as well, just in case it's gotten lost. And yeah, I hope that everyone felt like they got something out of today, because I feel like I definitely did. And I really hope that all of you enjoy the rest of your night. So I'll end the recording now. But yeah, thank you.